Good morning. This is Professor Madeline Edelman, and we're going to start in just a couple minutes to make sure everyone can get into their virtual seats. Really looking forward to today's talk. Okay, good morning. So we will start this morning's Seeking Justice in Arizona series talk. And I'm going to put my video on, and we have a couple of slides to share with you to start off. Again, I wanted to welcome you to Seeking Justice in Arizona on behalf of the Faculty of Justice and Social Inquiry and the School of Social Transformation. I wanted to give you just a little bit of background on the Seeking Justice in Arizona series. We are now, I believe it's our 16th year, and the faculty decided to put together this lecture series in order to bring in the expertise and all the experiences of people around the state of Arizona who are doing just incredible things and pursuing justice in ways that some of our students and our faculty may not be familiar with. Some are very familiar, that you are studying about in your classes. We wanted to make a space for people who are doing work both on and beyond the campus. And this year we have just a stellar lineup of speakers, and today is no exception. I wanted to give you a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll move on to the introductions. This session is being recorded. It will be available online on the Seeking Justice in Arizona website. For anyone who is viewing this within the campus, if you know someone who's off campus who would like to join us this morning, just simply tell them to search for Seeking Justice in Arizona, Arizona State University. They will find the page. They can scroll down to our guest speaker this morning, November 12th, and they'll be able to find the YouTube link right there on the webpage. Today, we will have a Q&A at the end of the talk. That Q&A function should be available for you all on Zoom. The YouTube folks will be able to view, but not comment this morning. And in addition to our guest speaker, we have two Justice Studies faculty members joining us. One is my colleague, Professor Anna Marie Oliverio, whose scholarly and teaching expertise centers on terrorism and disability studies. I know that many of her students are joining us this morning, so welcome. Professor Oliverio will introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. Before that, I wanted to introduce our second faculty colleague here this morning, Professor Rashad Shabazz, whose students are also joining us this morning. Welcome to you all. As part of our Justice Studies 105 Introduction to Justice Studies course, we are hosting the Seeking Justice in Arizona series. So thank you very much, Professor Shabazz. And I'd like to welcome you to address your students at this time. Thank you.
Good morning, students. Welcome to the Seeking Justice lecture series. This is the second one held in our class, and we are very happy to have our speaker today. Our speaker will be engaging topics that are familiar to us, and the conceptual tools around race, gender, class, and sexuality will be really useful optics for us to think about and engage the talk. So I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts. And I will turn it back over to Professor Edelman. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to toss it very quickly to Professor Anna Marie Oliverio, who will be doing the introduction this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Drs. Edelman and Shabazz, for inviting me and my terrorism, war, and justice class to participate and introduce the guest speaker. It is fortuitous for us to have Ms. Kramer here today, as this fall semester 2020, our School of Social Transformation launched 2 new disability studies certificate programs, a grad and undergrad program, both designed and focused on exposing systemic and structural problems and barriers that disabled communities continually face. Also, I'd like to share that there are a growing number of diverse resources on disability studies that can be accessed through the ASU Library website in the form of LibGuides. Dr. Edelman has kindly, or will kindly post some links for you for anyone who is interested in further information on either the disability certificates and/or resources. And now it is my pleasure to tell you a little bit about our guest speaker, Ms. Megan Kramer. Ms. Kramer is a staff attorney at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, the ACDL, where she advocates for Arizonans who have a wide range of physical, mental, psychiatric, sensory, and cognitive disabilities. Ms. Kramer is currently targeting systemic issues affecting Arizonans with disabilities in the areas of employment, housing, healthcare, education, voting, and prisons. The ACDL uses advocacy, lobbying, and impact litigation to bring positive change to Arizona's disability community. But before joining the ACDL, Ms. Kramer spent 9 years in private practice as a labor and employment attorney and worked on sexual harassment cases during the onset of the Me Too era. She presents and writes on topics related to accommodations and discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Title VII protections in the workplace. Ms. Kramer also serves as the chair of the Center for Habilitation, the largest nonprofit supporting Arizonans with intellectual and developmental disabilities. TCH provides employment opportunities, day programs, home support, and group homes for Arizonans with disabilities. Today, Ms. Kramer will be presenting about systemic changes for Arizonans with disabilities, and I'd like to turn this over to Ms. Kramer now.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I just wanted to thank the faculty for inviting me and the School of Social Transformation. It's an honor to be here to talk about disabilities, which is an issue that's been very special to me for a long time. Bear with me for a moment. I'm going to start my slideshow here. I believe you should all be seeing the screen now. I just wanted to start by, as I was thinking about the name of this series, Seeking Justice, it was important to me to really acknowledge at the beginning of this presentation that justice is an ideal. And, we're not going to get there in my lifetime with the disability issues, and we may not get there in several lifetimes, but it is an ideal, and the work is essential. And so as social causes go, you've heard about other social causes this semester in your courses. Disabilities is one that we don't often hear about, but it's one that affects the broadest number of individuals worldwide. And so I wanted to kind of start by talking about holistically, what is disability? Who are the people with disabilities? And some of this will be, repetitive for some of you, but I think it's helpful to see the information as a whole. Starting off, 1 in 4 American adults has a disability. In Arizona, that number is slightly higher. We have a higher number of people who are over the age of 65 here, which may play into that statistic. But it's staggering to think, that at least 1 in 4 Americans that you encounter self-identifies as having a disability of some kind. Now, there's different types of disabilities that we're going to cover today. We're not going to get into too much detail But there's disabilities having to do with mobility. Sometimes these are the most visual disabilities that we encounter. We'll see someone using a wheelchair or using a walker to get around. There's also cognition disabilities. These are people who are limited in difficulty concentrating, remembering, decision making. There are people who have functional disabilities related to independent living. People who have trouble, hearing or seeing, deaf and blind people, or people somewhere on that spectrum. And then there are people who have trouble with self-care due to a variety of different disabilities. And I know you all have probably spent some time talking about, in various contexts, intersectionality. We're going to talk about that a bit today because disability affects people in different protected groups differently. 2 in 5 adults over the age of 65 have a disability. 1 in 4 women have a disability. 2 in 5 non-Hispanic American Indians and Alaska Natives have a disability. That's a significantly higher number than the general population. And we don't often talk about mental illness as disability, but it is. And this chart shows 12-month prevalence of common mental illnesses in all US adults. And it's significant. 1 in 5 Americans is experiencing mental illness. 1 in 25 is experiencing a serious mental illness. You can see, what some of the larger numbers are. Depression, anxiety disorders. These are significant and often not very visible disabilities. You may not know that the person sitting next to you is suffering from one of these disabilities. And you may not know, that someone in your family or your colleague has one of these disabilities. Now, mental illness is reported at higher rates in certain communities, again. And these are self-reported statistics. And so I don't believe these to be as high as they actually are. But if you look, for example, adults who report as mixed or multiracial, 27% identify as having some type of mental illness. 37% of LGBTQ people identify as having some sort of mental illness diagnosis. These are significant numbers. And as I said, these disabilities are often not visible to us. Intellectual and developmental disabilities are also significant. 1 in 6, or about 17% of children ages 3 through 17 have 1 or more intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities. And developmental disabilities can include many things: ADHD, autism, anyone on the autism spectrum disorder, cerebral palsy, hearing loss, learning disabilities, vision impairments. These are all developmental disabilities or developmental delays. And the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities defines an intellectual disability as those cognitive developmental disabilities that are characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behavior, which covers many everyday social and practical skills. So these two are oftentimes not very visible disabilities. And then I wanted to talk briefly, because we do talk about intersectionality some, I wanted to talk about disabilities among incarcerated people. And just move this so I can see my own slide. About 32% of individuals incarcerated in prisons and about 40% of those incarcerated in jails have reported having at least one disability. Again, this is a self-report, so I believe those numbers are probably lower than they actually are. People incarcerated in prisons are 4 times as likely, and people incarcerated in jails are 6 times more likely to report a cognitive disability than the general population. And people with mental health conditions comprise a large portion of those as well. The Bureau of Justice Statistics reports that 1 in 5 prison inmates identifies as having a serious mental illness. That's a very staggering statistic. And 37%, I got this information from the National Association of Mental Illness, 37% of Americans incarcerated in state and federal prisons have a diagnosed mental health condition. That's a staggering number. That's 2 in 5. And the number of drug-dependent individuals incarcerated in the US is exceptionally high. It's as high as 60% of Black Americans have been diagnosed with a substance use disorder. That's a very high percentage. Substance use disorders are protected as disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, you know, long before we were talking about COVID every day, we were talking about the opioid epidemic, and that hasn't gone away just because we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's still happening. The statistics, as I'm sure you all have seen, are staggering. There are an estimated, this is old data from 2018, 10.3 million Americans misused prescription drugs in 2018. And substance abuse and mental health issues tend to go hand in hand. You can see on this slide, the graphic on the right, 7.7 million Americans right now have a co-occurrence of both substance abuse problems and mental health issues. And these are people who are out there, you know, in the workforce with you and I, or trying to get into the workforce, and they're trying to get housing, and you know, they're just trying to live their lives just like you and I and not be discriminated against, and these people are protected. And so that's another way that disability is not often visible. You know, it's sometimes difficult to tell who has one of these substance use disorders. And then I know in particular in Professor Oliverio's class, you all have been studying the military and disabilities flowing from military service. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that traumatic brain injury is a very prominent and prevalent disability these days. About 500,000 Americans have returned from our 20-year war on terror, and they've returned with that's the number that approximately that's returned with a diagnosed traumatic brain injury. The repercussions from these disabilities are vast, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A. You know, these people are re-entering the workforce, the civilian workforce, and there are linger effects that this disability causes. And so that's something we can talk about a little bit later. But essentially, you know, I just wanted to really focus on the question of who are people with disabilities, and the answer, you know, kind of eloquently stated by a friend of mine, Andrew Jacobs, is after reviewing all of this data, they're us. They are all of us. They are you and me, and members of your family, and colleagues of yours. They're going to be colleagues of yours when you enter the workplace, if you're not already. They're going to live in the apartment next to you, and they're everywhere. And so this is, you know, the world's largest minority, and it's worth talking about. You know, these issues are not something that are often front of mind for us, but I wanted to make sure that we talked about the breadth of disability before we kind of dug into some of the issues facing people with disabilities. So you all hopefully recognize some of the guys in this photo. I say guys because I'm unable to see a single woman in this photo, but this is President Lyndon Johnson, and what they're signing here in July of 1964 is the Civil Rights Act, which I'm sure, given what you all are studying, you're familiar with. this civil rights and labor law that outlawed discrimination. It prohibited segregation, racial segregation in schools, public accommodations, and employment discrimination. And this law brought long overdue recourse and effectively ended Jim Crow in the United States. But I wanted to make clear to you all, because this happened in 1964, that this law protected just these categories. If you can see that there: race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And we learned recently in Bostock versus Clayton that this law also protects transgender folks and people on the basis of sexual orientation. But there's no disability here. And so from 1964 until the 1990s, people with disability essentially had no recourse. You know, you walk into a job, you apply, your employer does not like the fact that you have, say you're blind, your employer does not like the fact that you're blind. You could be denied on that basis alone and have no recourse in the courts. And so, like many powerful social justice movements we've had in the past, people with disabilities fought. They fought very hard to get the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. And this image you're seeing here, 26 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, this is March of 1990, over 1,000 people marched from the White House to the US Capitol to demand that Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is just one of many, many demonstrations that we don't know very much about. You know, we don't learn about these in school as much as we learn about other civil rights movements. But when they got to the steps of the Capitol, about 60 of these people in this movement cast aside their walkers and their wheelchairs, and they crawled the steps of the Capitol to the top. And it was such a statement. It really highlighted the urgency that the Americans with Disabilities Act needed to be passed. And so it was. I mean, they were successful. And this is a quote from a video I'll show you in a moment. We were finally recognized as citizens of the world. And it wasn't until 1990 that these protections were carved into federal law. Now, there are a couple of other federal laws that protected people with disabilities before the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm thinking particularly of the Rehabilitation Act, passed in 1973, and Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which used to be called something else, but that was passed in 1975, which provided protections in schools. But with respect to public accommodations, with respect to employment, there weren't protections for people with disabilities until this act was passed in 1990, which was really only 30 years ago, which is incredible to think about. So now I'm going to play you this video, which is about 6 minutes, but it's very moving, and I think it's worth the time.
On the day Bush signed the ADA, we convinced him that we should make it a great big celebration since there are so many people directly affected by the passage of the ADA.
Well, it was a glorious day. July 26, 1990 was a clear blue sky. The sun was out. There were 3,000 or 4,000 people, many with disabilities and their families, on the south lawn of the White House. And the president was on a platform with leaders of the disability community to sign the bill into law.
I don't know how you describe the signing ceremony. We had people everywhere. They were on gurneys, white canes, wheelchairs, walkers, and seeing-eye dogs. I mean, any device that helped people get around was represented that day. We covered the White House lawn for sure.
The most people ever gathered on the White House lawn for a signing was July 26, 1990. Never been that many people there for a signing of a bill before. Biggest group ever in the history of this country.
I had the pleasure and the real privilege to ride to the ADA signing ceremony with John McCain. So we drove right into the White House, and then we walked outside and became part of the masses. The South Lawn was packed with people. All of them there had worked and worked and worked to see the law pass. So it was a shining day and a shining moment. And I mean, history and the weather just cooperated in a way you don't see very often.
I sat with Senator Kennedy in the 89th row back or something like that. And, you know, all the pomp and circumstance began, and we were kibitzing with each other and kind of looking over the crowd, and Kennedy leaned over to me and he said, Pat, I said, yes, Senator, I got a little problem here. And I said, what's that, Senator? He goes, what happens if he reads the bill before he signs it? I said, don't worry. I mean, the senator knew that nobody really understood the impact of what this piece of legislation was going to do.
I now lift my pen to sign this American...
And then the president ended his brief remarks with that clarion call, let the shameful wall...
Let the shameful wall...
Of exclusion...
Of exclusion...
Finally come tumbling down.
Finally come tumbling down.
And that sent a tremor through the entire crowd.
Best moment was President Bush was there. He was signing the ADA. Evan Kemp was on one side. Sandy Perino was on the other side. And there was a priest, Reverend Wilkie. And he had no arms. So the president signs the legislation, and then he hands the pen. He hands the pen to Evan, hands the pen to Sandy. And then President Bush hands the pen to Reverend Wilkie with no arms. So he picks up his foot and grabs it with his toes. It's the perfect moment right there.
There was a lot of pent-up emotion and anticipation in that crowd. And when the president finally put his signature on the bill, a great roar of approval went up, and it was extraordinarily special. And then the rest of the day was given over to celebration. A lot of folks who had put in years, decades, trying to reach the point that was achieved that day, let their hair down and had a lot of fun.
Just this feeling of we did it. I mean, here we were, having been told for so long how powerless we were, and here we were with the President of the United States signing this document that was our Emancipation Proclamation, essentially. It was just a fantastic feeling.
It was one of the most electric moments in time. It was like we were transported to another place. We were 20 feet off the ground. 3,000 people were 20 feet off the ground. It was like a tremendous party. A very controlled, love, respect, joy, accomplishment, satisfaction. Our time had come. We finally were recognized as citizens of the world.
I just thought of how much my brother had been discriminated against all his life because of his disability. When you see something like this and you see the president signing it, that goes through your head. You think about this, you think, well, maybe this isn't in time to help my brother. But you think about how many other people won't have to go through that, because of this. I just thought, gee, this is something that I think is going to unleash a lot of people with disabilities in this country to do things that they never thought they could do before.
I had the sense that the moment was one that I would never forget, that there was a ceremony, and the ceremony was very important, but the moment was much more than that. The moment was a recognition of the rights and abilities of people with disabilities, a recognition of respect for people with disabilities, a recognition of the end of discrimination against people with disabilities, and that the spirit of that, the feeling, whole crowd, was that in American Sign Language there's a sign for that, and the sign is it's called PA. PA. That's how you make a sound when you sound it, PA. And that was a PA day. That was the day that you guys saw us as your peers and not as someone who needed your help.
Okay. So I know that was a little long. I just wanted to make sure that, everyone really understood the weight of, it's such a lovely video, and I wanted to really emphasize what a moment that was. And it wasn't that long ago. And so, we've sort of talked about disability as a whole, but let's actually kind of get into who are the people that the Americans with Disability Act protects. So it protects an individual with a disability who either has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or they have a record of having such an impairment, or perhaps they're regarded as having such an impairment. For example, an employer will mistakenly think that an employee has cancer, for example, and maybe they don't. But the employer cannot discriminate against the employee on that basis. And so what are major life activities? Well, they cover a real vast set of activities. Caring for yourself is a major life activity. Performing manual tasks, seeing and hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, reading, concentrating, thinking, communicating, working. And in addition to that, the ADA includes major bodily functions, which really ropes in a lot of additional disabilities. And these are functions that have to do with the immune system, cell growth, digestive and bowel processes, the bladder, neurological, brain, respiratory, circulatory, endocrine, and reproductive functions. And so it's really the number of people who are protected under this act is incredible. And the act really protects people in three primary ways. The first one is in employment, which I know some of you have been talking a little bit about. And that's how I came to be involved in the work that I'm in. Is I've practiced employment law basically since I started practicing law about a decade ago. And employment is such a special area because the ability to work and to provide for oneself and to contribute to society is something that really, it's one of the fundamental ways that we all get dignity, that we feel dignity as individuals. And people with disabilities are out there working, and they're contributing to society like everyone else. And they're entitled to work at their jobs and not be discriminated against on the basis of their disability. And in addition to that, some of you may be familiar with, especially in light of the pandemic, I can't give this presentation and not talk about how the pandemic has affected people with disabilities, but if you're wanting to work in a job and your disability may cause you to be unable to complete some of the essential tasks of your job, if there's some way that your employer can accommodate you in that work, for example, the employer may allow you to telework during a pandemic because you're immunocompromised, as a result of a disability that you have. If the employer can do that and it doesn't cause the employer an undue burden, an undue hardship, the employer is required to do so. And that process that employers and employees are engaging in all over the country right now is called the interactive process. And the way that that works is, I'm an employee with a disability. I know that I want to keep doing my job despite the fact that I have a disability. And I know that if I just get this one accommodation, I have an idea for an accommodation, I ask my employer, is this possible? And the employer and the employee go back and forth and they share information with each other and they try to agree on a solution that doesn't cause the employer an undue hardship. You know, a significant number of reasonable accommodations cause the employer no hardship at all, and allows the employee to perform the essential functions of their job. And it's such a wonderful process because it's interactive and it's supposed to be taken care of outside of litigation. You know, this is a process, oftentimes when we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, we're talking about filing lawsuits. And this is something that, you know, it doesn't come to a lawsuit unless there's a breakdown in the interactive process and the employer's just not doing their duty. But it's a really beautiful process when it works, because it just allows people to communicate with each other and to find solutions, you know, that allow this person to continue to contribute to their employer and to society and to be able to provide for their families. So that's employment. It's a very special one to me. And then Title II protects, you know, discrimination by public entities and in public transportation. And then Title III, public accommodations and commercial facilities. So, you know, this is what we think about when you want to be able to gain access to a mall, for example, and are in a wheelchair and there is no ramp. The mall has got to make their entrance, because they're open for business. They've got to make their entrance accessible to people in wheelchairs, because their commercial facility is subject to Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So I know I don't have much longer, but I just wanted to spend a little time talking about a couple of case studies outside of, you know, the pandemic. I just wanted to focus on a couple of things that are going on in the country. You know, we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act taking down, you know, the shameful barriers, and it was a great step in the right direction, but we're just not there yet. And that's what this ongoing sort of impact litigation that you'll hear about on the news is about. People are now using, you know, legal advocates are using the Americans with Disabilities Act to make the world accessible to people with disabilities. So what you're seeing in this picture is San Diego. And some of you all may be familiar with these devices that are scattered across the sidewalk here. They're scooters. And I know they have these in Tempe and in downtown Phoenix. For those of you that are local, you're familiar with these. Maybe you've ridden on them. They're electric or motorized scooters. They're available to rent. There are also bicycles, I think, in this picture. And you're looking at a photograph that appeared in the New York Times last year in a piece called "Welcome to San Diego, Don't Mind the Scooters." And last January, a number of individuals, this is in 2019, with disabilities filed a lawsuit in the Southern District of California, and they alleged, among other things, that the city of San Diego and private scooter companies failed to maintain the accessibility of the city's public sidewalks and transit stops for people with disabilities. So in addition, if you're someone who does not have a mobility disability, you're not blind, you know, this is unsightly for sure, but it may not occur to you immediately, but this is a very dangerous situation. It makes it very difficult for someone in a wheelchair, for example, to just simply get from point A to point B in the city of San Diego. Maybe they can't access their bus stop. You know, maybe they can't access the sidewalk. And then imagine that you're blind, that you're legally blind, and you know, you walk from work to home, and this is, you know, one of the streets that you have to walk on. this is absolutely a barrier, and it's a very dangerous one. And I'm quoting now Aaron Greason, who's one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, who's blind. He said he now never leaves the blind center anymore. He's already fallen once because of the scooters, and he doesn't want it to happen again. And we as a society, I won't really get into sort of the shameful history of the way our society, and not just our American society, but our world history has treated people with disabilities. It's out there for you to Google, you know, from the Spanish Inquisition to Nazi Germany to, you know, even American colonial times. There was intentional, horrific acts committed against people with disabilities. We're now hopefully coming to a time where most of the discrimination in America that happens against people with disabilities is, you know, sloppy. It's inadvertent. The scooter company did not start out thinking, I'm going to make life miserable for people with mobility disabilities and blind people in San Diego. But this is what we've got. And so that lawsuit is pending, and they brought it under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that has given these people recourse. The city of San Diego filed a motion to dismiss and tried to boot this lawsuit. And the judge said, no, you're subject to these claims, and these plaintiffs are going to have their day in court. And so that this is being litigated now. There's a motion for a preliminary injunction that's pending in the Southern District of California. And so just keep your eye out on this case. You know, in addition to litigation, what can you do as a private citizen who maybe doesn't have a law degree yet, and you're, you know, walking the streets of Tempe or downtown Phoenix? If you see something like this, it might be nice to, you know, move it out of the way. You know, we have an obligation to each other, I believe, as, you know, co-citizens, and it's important to not ignore things that we know to be problems. And so this is a problem we have here locally as well, and I hope it's something that gets addressed everywhere. And then I also wanted to talk about another case study. You know, as an attorney, it's difficult. I can't talk about my own clients because of ethical reasons, but these are just a couple of cases that I thought were interesting. This case involves a young man who needed a lung transplant because he had cystic fibrosis, which is a condition that affects your lungs. And he also happened to be a former opioid user and diagnosed with opioid use disorder. And that is a disability, as we talked about, under the ADA. And specifically, he was being treated with a drug called Suboxone, which is a prescription medication approved by the FDA to treat opioid use disorder. And he was not currently, when he needed this lung transplant, he was not currently engaged in the use of illegal drugs. He wasn't using, there was you know, drug tests to confirm that he wasn't currently using opioid drugs. Notwithstanding that fact, his local hospital, which was Mass General in Massachusetts, denied his request for a lung transplant on the basis that he had opioid use disorder. And, you know, while it would have been lawful for them to deny him on the basis of being a current user of opioids, because that could have put, you know, the organs at risk, there was no evidence. You know, they did no research to determine whether his being a former opioid user, being diagnosed with opioid use disorder but not using, and using this FDA approved drug to keep him in recovery, was going to lead to any issue with his organs. And so the Department of Justice filed a complaint and sued the hospital, and it's resulted in a settlement that's now public. Eventually the young man was able to get a transplant from another hospital. Mass General did not give him the transplant. He needed it urgently. So he got his lung transplant from another hospital, and Mass General had to pay him $250,000. This was a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in addition to that, they had to kind of redo their non-discrimination policies at Mass General. They had to implement employee training on ADA requirements and adhere to specific reporting obligations to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So as I said, he was awarded $250,000 for emotional distress and expenses. And that's justice done for one young man. But just because, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't mean that, the world is now discrimination-free for people with disabilities. These are just a couple of examples. And here in Arizona, we're fighting our own battles. A lot of these issues are similar to what people see everywhere, but people with disabilities still need a lot of assistance from advocates. And so that's why I was so glad to see that this certificate program has been created at ASU. It's something I definitely would have taken if I was an undergrad or a graduate student and that was offered. And I'll tell you why. If you are interested, disability issues affect every social justice issue. If you're interested in working on solutions to homelessness, veterans issues, criminal justice reform, re-entry of returning citizens issues, healthcare access and affordability, justice for LGBTQ folks, affordable housing, lowering unemployment, if you're interested in, voting issues, immigration, education, I'm telling you, if any of these social justice issues light you up, then there is a place for you in this fight. And disability issues are an essential tool. Disability advocacy will be an essential tool in your toolbox. You'll just need to be fluent in this stuff. And excuse me. Again, I think that's all I have for now, but I wanted to just sort of emphasize where I started at the beginning. Justice is an ideal, but we will get there if we have the right people acting as advocates, as legal advocates, elections, working on elections that matter, educating your elected officials about disability issues. And, there's a place for you in this fight. I just wanted to emphasize that. So I will stop sharing my screen. I know we have some questions.
Thank you, Megan, for your presentation. And yes, I would like to invite and encourage people to please write your questions in the Q&A so that I can go through them and ask Megan the questions. But before I turn to the Q&A, so it gives you a chance to post them, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, Megan.
Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, just a question for you, and that is, how has COVID impacted your ability to serve disabled clients?
Well, in the employment arena in particular, it's helped in some ways because oftentimes people with disabilities ask for an accommodation to telework. And for the longest time, employers told us that's impossible. People will not telework efficiently. They just can't do it. They can't be on their computers all day from their homes. And here we are, yes, everyone's doing it. And that bogeyman has kind of been debunked. So from an employment perspective, it has helped. But I will say, anytime we are sort of legislating in a hurry, there are negative impacts on people with disabilities because we're just not often thoughtful about ways that even the smallest policy change will affect people with disabilities. For example, masks. Masks are wonderful. Everyone should be wearing a mask. But unless you have a see-through mask, some people won't understand what you're saying. There are a lot of people out there for whom lip reading is essential. And, in our stores and in our restaurants and at schools and in hospitals, people often don't even have access to these clear masks. And so it's really been a communication barrier for some people with disabilities. In addition to that, boy, there's been a lot. You know, a lot of people with disabilities are involved in some type of facility. There are people in nursing homes. There are people with developmental disabilities often live in group homes. And it has been a dangerous time to live in a facility like that. And so as part of our mandate at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, we do some monitoring and we have some protection powers to sort of go in and make sure that everything is going as it should in some of these facilities. But it is a dangerous time to live in a group home. And, you know, for some people with developmental disabilities, they're just cooped up in these group homes now, and they're not able to go out into the workforce or go to a day program, for example. And some of that has changed recently, although we're now deep into the second wave and it's become dangerous again. And so it's just a tough time, you know, just like everyone else, there are heightened mental health issues that come from isolation, and it's been a tough time.
Yes. Well, in my class this past week, in honor of Veterans Day, we have been talking about veterans and disability. And one of the questions that students had, and they'd like me to ask you, is are physical disability applications for compensations more likely to be accepted than mental or psychological disabilities? After some of the readings that we did, they were concerned about, you know, the differences between the way that mental disabilities are approached, psychological, PTSD, emotional disabilities. How does all that fall? Let us share a little bit of your experience with us.
Sure. Well, there's not really, I mean, there should not be a hierarchy. But as I mentioned earlier, visibility is, for whatever reason, carries a lot of weight with people. So, you know, in my work, and I used to represent employers, I truly don't believe that employers come to work every day intending to discriminate against anybody for the most part. You know, they're just trying to run oftentimes a small business and doing the best that they can. But it is sometimes a harder sell in that interactive process to explain that someone needs an accommodation, for example, for a mental health issue. Maybe someone needs to spend, you know, a certain amount of time every day going for a walk due to anxiety, for example, and then coming back to their desk to complete their job. That can be a harder sell, and it shouldn't have to be. But that's sort of what the interactive process is for. And the good news is, for the most part, these things don't cost the employers a lot of money. You know, sometimes if an employer has to sort of retrofit a building, buy an expensive piece of equipment, provide a full-time ASL interpreter, these are very expensive asks. But sometimes things for mental health or for a cognitive issue aren't really that expensive. And so therefore, the way the law should work is they shouldn't be that tough of a sell. And question, do most employers understand their obligations under the interactive process? The answer is probably no. Hopefully, you know, they are savvy enough to do their research or call a lawyer who will just sort of tell them, you know, communication works, engage in this process and the communication works, but it's not always the case.
Yeah. Have you ever lost a case with a disability issue?
You know, just like everything else, these issues get resolved via settlement very, very often. I've never had a disability trial. I've certainly had losses procedurally along the way in cases. And I guess the real question is, have I ever not gotten the result that my client wanted in some kind of, you know, interim settlement or something like that? That's the case often. Right. You know, when someone comes to litigation, you know, there are sort of multiple levels. There's what they're entitled to, and there's what they'll often be able to get without having to endure the pain that often comes from, you know, a lengthy trial. And so that's just unfortunately the way the legal process works. I wish that there were cheap and fair and speedy trials, but we don't really that's not the way our court systems work these days.
Which can also be a problem for disabled communities that don't have the resources to access those.
Correct. Yeah, there is absolutely access to justice gap that is significant, and it doesn't just affect people with disabilities. I mean, I used to say to myself when I was practicing in private practice, I would not be able to afford my own fees if I needed to hire myself for something, which is a problem. So the justice gap is a bigger issue that affects people far beyond the disability community, and there's something needs to be done about it.
Right. I'm going to look at the Q&A, and there is a question here that says, have you ever, no, that's not the one. Let's see. What do you see as the most urgent disability justice issues in Arizona?
I will say, you know, it's hard to, it's like when someone asks you, what's your favorite song? You know, there's a lot of most urgent issues. Okay. There was a wonderful article that I would refer people to by Amy Silverman that came out in a coordinated piece between ProPublica and the Arizona Daily Star. This came out last week about the way that our Department of Division of Developmental Disabilities in Arizona is, you know, there are systemic issues and people who are entitled to benefits in Arizona are not getting them. Mm-hmm. That I see as a very urgent issue. There are people who are entitled to benefits. Our law mandates that they receive them. They are applying for these benefits, and for a variety of systemic issues, they are not receiving them. And that is an urgent issue at the moment.
Yeah. In fact, last year there was a case, Hacienda Healthcare.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you share any information about that, or?
Yeah. Hacienda Healthcare involved a woman who was severely disabled, who was in a facility and was raped while she was in the facility and was unable to communicate about the fact that she was raped. And, you know, the facility itself did not discover what had happened until, you know, essentially she was 8.5 months pregnant and gave birth to a child. And, you know, that is obviously an example of assault. You know, the man involved raped her and, you know, has been charged in that case. But in addition to that, that is institutional failure, which happens, you know, probably more often than we know, unfortunately. But part of our mandate at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, and just a little bit of background, every state has what's called a protection and advocacy agency. And in Arizona, it's the Arizona Center for Disability Law. And our job, we're grant funded, is we are sort of supposed to protect and advocate for people with disabilities. So part of our job is we're going in now and looking at facilities and making sure that everything is going as it should. Hopefully that was a wake-up call for facilities where there may have been corner cutting and mismanagement, to make sure that their facilities are being run safely.
Okay. I know that a number of our students in the Justice Studies program and all over social transformation are interested in going to law school. So what made you decide to become a disability lawyer?
Well, for the longest time, I was just an employment lawyer. And as a law student, the employment cases were fun to read about. You know, they're sets of facts where you really sort of feel the injustice. And in addition to that, I kind of liked the procedural part of employment law. I like being in on an emergency preliminary injunction, for example. It's fun to sort of, the law sometimes moves so slowly, cases move so slowly. It's nice to ask for something in a hurry and to sometimes get it. And so I found a lot of joy in that. But I moved to the Arizona Center for Disability Law because I went to law school because I cared about justice. And this is a place where I can do that kind of work. And it is the most rewarding job. I could have never imagined having a job this rewarding. Every day I get to, push the ball a little bit forward and help people and it's all just mission work. It's a lot of fun. Anyone considering law school, any kind of civil rights work, it's not going to pay as well as a law firm, but you're going to have a very fulfilling life.
Okay. Well, so then can you offer some recommendations to students considering law school in terms of skills and experiences that they could prepare besides getting a disability studies certificate?
Sure. I would say study what you're interested in as an undergrad, and it doesn't matter if it has anything to do with law school or not. Some of my colleagues in law school studied, sciences or math, or they were engineers. And that stuff is useful when you get into your practice. If that's what you're interested in, maybe you become a medical malpractice attorney or a patent attorney. Or, if you're into music, major in music. You don't get to get your undergraduate degree twice. And you are required to know nothing when you get to law school at all. You show up, they've let you in. That's all you need to know. That's the base that you need to know. I will say a skill that is helpful is learning how to read through material that might be a little bit dense. Most of the reading that you do in law school is really interesting, but it might be long. And so if you're not used to kind of reading long form, it might be helpful to, pick up The Economist every once in a while and read some articles in The Economist and really get used to, doing some lengthy reading where you're kind of having to spot a number of issues.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in your presentation that there are about 500,000 diagnosed traumatic brain injury cases having come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. How many, do you know any of the demographics, like how many are men and women versus women?
I did not do a lot of that research. I know that the studies of, just in preparing for this presentation, I think I was reading something on the VA. There are not a lot of studies about how traumatic brain injury affects women, just because I think oftentimes when they're doing the studies, they control for gender for whatever reason, and they're studying men. And so
that's interesting.
It is interesting. And, there are certainly women and non-military women who have traumatic brain injuries. And that's another one that's not a very visible injury. So you may have no idea who in your life has suffered from a traumatic brain injury. But I will say, at the center, we're trying to do more work with traumatic brain injury. And it's sort of an interesting demographic. It's a tough demographic to reach out to. And I think part of that is the VA is kind of taking care of military people on its own. And so we don't see a lot of those issues. I'd like us to handle more of them. And certainly with respect to employment discrimination, for example, I'd like us to really tap into that community and see what we can do for them.
Yeah, yes. I'm going to go into the question and answer here. And let's see. In cases you've worked on so far, do you often see race and disability discrimination happening together?
I do. I mean, there is a significant element of intersectionality. I will say, oftentimes when we're dealing with an issue, sometimes the basis for the discrimination, the basis that's being alleged is just disability, but our demographics, we're seeing a very diverse set of people who've been discriminated against. We see, a lot of Black Arizonans. We see a lot of Latina Arizonans. We see a lot of LGBT Arizonans, and oftentimes that's not alleged as one of the bases for discrimination. We also see gender and disability combinations frequently.
Yes. Okay. Another question from the Q&A. How does your center decide which cases to accept?
That is a tough job. That is not my job. But what we're really looking to do, we can't help everyone who calls. Like every advocacy organization, I wish we could. We can't help everyone who calls. What we're really trying to do are, people are calling at this level, they're all individuals. And what we need to do is identify what are the systemic issues that are creating these pockets of individuals, and we need to address those systemic issues. And so if we have a bunch of people calling, for example, and saying, I have a disability, it's during COVID, my employer is not letting me telework even though I'm extremely immunocompromised, we might sort of go after that as a big issue, and that way hopefully help a lot of people, because our goal is to help all the people who don't even know we're there as well. You know, the number of people who learn about the Arizona Center for Disability Law is very small compared to the number of people who need our help.
Okay. Liat Ben Moshe is a scholar that we've had recently, a few years ago actually, come to the university. She's a disability studies scholar, and she discusses the need to decarcerate disability. What does that process look like to you from a legal perspective?
Well, you know, it's a complicated process. For example, there are so many systems in place that need to be broken down in order for that to happen. You know, looking back at our statistics of the number of people who are incarcerated, who have substance abuse problems, who have mental health issues, who have cognitive and intellectual disabilities, you know, there are a number of questions. I don't want to get political, but questions about, you know, how did people end up in the system in the first place? You know, was it, you know, were the police the first call? And if so, you know, was there something else that could have been done at that moment in order to help this person who was probably in crisis at the time? And, you know, that's a significant percentage. In addition, you know, people need to, while they're actually incarcerated, they need to receive the services that they're entitled to. And there is ongoing litigation in Arizona and everywhere to make sure that people who are incarcerated in jails and prisons are receiving mental health services that they're entitled to, the actual healthcare, you know, therapy that they're entitled to. And that battle will never end. That will go on forever because, you know, there's just, as long as there are people who our government has locked up, there need to be advocates making sure that these people are getting the care that they need, because those people alone, they don't have the power in our society to get that for themselves.
Okay. A question that one of my students had was, what is the success rate for veterans, young veterans coming back with combat-specific job experience and a disability when they come back, when transitioning into a civilian career field?
You know, I don't know a lot about that, unfortunately. I would point you to the VA or someone. As I said, I wish that we helped more with veterans who were having issues getting accommodations at work, for example. I think a lot of people are really scared. This isn't just veterans, but I think a lot of people are really scared to tell their employer, I have a disability, here's what it is. And that is understandable. You know, we live in a society where we don't want to tell our employers about what our religion is, or, you know, about our personal lives, or what our disability is, because we are afraid that they might hold that against us. But in this case, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, although sure, they can retaliate against you and then you'd have another claim, but you are legally entitled to tell them, this is what's happening with me, and this is what I need to be able to do my job. And I worry that there's just too many people out there, veterans included, who don't understand their rights, and because of that are not getting what they're entitled to in the workplace.
Let me see here in the Q&A, there's a couple of new questions. Would you consider decriminalization of substances, at least in part, a disability issue?
Oh, I absolutely think so. And I know, you know, since the proposition passed last week, for those of you who've been following, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office has announced that they're dropping all charges against people for possession of marijuana, as an example. Correct. I mean, statistically, a significant number of those people who were charged with marijuana offenses have some type of disability that may include substance use disorder, and it may include additional disabilities. And so yes, that's huge, and not just for marijuana. Decriminalization is one part of the puzzle to sort of solving this issue of people who, you know, incarceration is not going to fix the problem, but we've used it as a solution for far too long.
Right. And recently, wasn't it also in Oregon where they decriminalized a number, like heroin use or cocaine use, or as well?
I think we're pretty far from doing that here in Arizona, but
yeah. So one of the participants was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the intersectionality of disability. Speaking from this person's personal experience and friends' experience, minority parents don't like to acknowledge mental illness. Yeah, how would you address this?
That is absolutely true. And I'll just use an example of, you know, for example, in schools, when children need help with a disability in school, the parents are an essential piece of that oftentimes. And there is shame in all, you know, this doesn't just affect, you know, other minority populations. There is shame across the spectrum associated with having disabilities still, you know, that there is stigma, and perhaps, you know, I just know this anecdotally, there are, you know, it's statistically significant that people from certain backgrounds, you know, experience more shame when it comes to acknowledging that there's a disability. But related to this piece that Amy Silverman did about people applying for disability benefits, in order to get benefits for some developmental disabilities in Arizona, you have to be able to establish that the disability manifested before the age of 18. And oftentimes, if a parent sort of shuts down the process of a child getting properly diagnosed, you know, this is long before the person with a disability who becomes an adult with a disability is able to advocate for themselves and say, I've got, you know, this is a thing about me and I need to, you know, get certain assistance. It's really within the parent's purview. And if the parent decides, you know, this is a shameful thing and we're not going to acknowledge that in this family, then the child may later have a difficult time establishing that a disability manifested before they were 18. And they may have trouble getting these disability benefits that they're really entitled to. And, you know, that's just one example, but absolutely, you know, stigma is an issue, and it's especially an issue with cognitive issues, with developmental disabilities, with mental health.
Oh. So just one final question for you, and that is also for our students who are interested in disability studies and continuing with this work. Can you suggest any complementary pathways to disability justice beyond law school?
Sure. I mean, if you are interested in any social justice issue, there are multiple pathways to get there. Social work is a great one. But really, you know, I listed a number of issues earlier. If you are interested in voting issues, if you are interested in education, if you want to become a teacher, you know, if you are interested in healthcare, if you want to work in policy, if you want to work, and legislatively, this stuff is important up and down the ballot. I'm not just talking about, you know, who you vote for Congress, for example. Your city council really, really matters when it comes to disability. Your school board really, really matters when it comes to disability issues in your community. And I'll just say, even if you own your own small business, you know, the way you behave as it relates to disability is going to have impact, you know, far beyond that which you'll ever see. And so we really, as a society, need to just start being more cognizant of disability issues as a whole. And words matter. just the way we talk about these issues really matters. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but there's a group at ASU that does, I think there's an ASU Center for Disability and Journalism. I could be getting that.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and that group put out a wonderful guide for the ways journalists should be talking about disability when they write about disability.
Yes.
I forget how many items are on there, but if you're not going to be a journalist, read that. It doesn't matter who you are. That should be mandatory reading for every member of our society. We need to be talking about these issues respectfully. And the Associated Press, I saw, just tweeted, it might have been this weekend, but they put out a tweet that basically said, stop using the words crazy and schizophrenic when you don't mean, in an offensive way, when you're not talking about people with disabilities. And it's true, journalists need to be cognizant. Journalists are keeping a historical record for our time. And, they and the rest of us need to be really cognizant of our words. That's just something you can do every day today, setting aside your career. But I really do hope, whatever you go into, that you just sort of treat this as, this is as important as issues having to do with LGBTQ folks. This is as important as race issues. It's up there. And just because sometimes the stuff isn't as visible in the news doesn't mean that it doesn't affect everyone around you.
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, Amy Silverman did write a really great piece on the use of the R word.
Yes, yes.
Which can be very loosely dropped.
Yes.
Oftentimes. Yeah, yeah. Right.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to our guest speaker and to our host this morning, now almost this afternoon. We really appreciate this discussion that I think has raised people's awareness and reinforced their commitment to disability advocacy and disability justice. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is the third in a series of 4 talks for Seeking Justice in Arizona. And our 4th talk is coming up on December 2nd, when we will have Miriam Araya, who will be speaking about Black Lives Matter Phoenix Metro. So December 2nd, 1:30 p.m. The links will be in the Seeking Justice in Arizona website, whether you're on campus using Zoom or off campus using the YouTube link. So again, thank you so much, Megan Kramer, and to my colleagues, Jeannie and Anna Marie and Rashad and James. I just want to say thank you very much for making this possible. Have a great day.
Thank you all.